Welcome to the Story Fulfilled podcast, where we deep dive into how each character and story in the Bible come together to fulfill the story of God.
I'm Abby.
I'm Jay.
And I'm Fletcher.
And today's episode is about the first kings of Israel, Saul and David. As usual, we encourage you to read the story for yourselves to get the whole story and learn more. So today's story takes place in 1 Samuel chapters 8 through 16.
So as we like to start each episode with a question or something to consider
We
or
sure
ponder,
do.
I have a question for you guys. So David, we find out later on, we won't talk about this today, but David had an encounter with a bear and a lion that he talks about in the story of David and Goliath. And so my question today is, what is a animal encounter, a wildlife or animal encounter that you've had that has stuck with you through time?
See, when you first asked the question, I'm like, well, David, conquered the wildlife. He ended up, spoiler, but he punched the bear and punched the lion. But I have an encounter that I did not necessarily win. I was scared the entire time. So I was snorkeling in the ocean. And all of a sudden it got really, really, really shallow. And there were sea urchins everywhere.
Oh, boy.
And I was just shaking and just trying to swim to a deeper area where I could actually swim away, but I was stuck in like my arms are out. You can't see it, but I'm like in an X starfish position trying to float away. And I was scared out of my mind to get stung by
But
a
did
sea
you get
urchin.
stung?
I did not.
Oh, that's good.
Right.
I sucked it in. I kept myself floaty.
Remember, Fletcher is 6'4" and 300
Hey.
pounds.
285.
Okay.
We'll go with. Not up to the minute on
So
my
tight
weight.
spaces. That person.
Yeah.
That's
it's
not,
okay.
that's
not
not
good.
so good.
Yeah.
That's funny. That's a
Abby,
good
what
one.
about you?
I have two, and they both involve snakes. I don't like snakes. Yeah. And so I was in Mexico, and we were walking by like a Mayan temple or whatever, and we're walking over, and there's this tree, and I'm leading and this snake just drops out of the tree in front of me, and literally if I had been one step ahead, that snake would have landed on my head, and I screamed so loudly and ran away, and it was awful.
Wow.
The next one was when I was in Malawi, and I was walking through like this little path in the forest to go on my way home from work. And this black snake, long black snake, which I later found out was a black mamba. Look it up yourself. They're super dangerous. And it was no joke. It was about 4 feet away from me. I just froze. I'm like, what do I do even? Like, what do you do right now? You can't. Snakes are the worst because you cannot predict them at all.
That's right.
Like, you don't
No.
see where
And they're way faster
going.
than you are.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was like, oh my gosh, I'm about to die and I don't know what's going to happen. And so like Fletcher, I was a coward.
Whoa!
Wildlife.
Oh my goodness!
I'm joining you with
I
it
didn't
at
hear
least.
Fletcher say he was a coward.
I was
Okay,
just a
well,
little
you know
scared.
what?
Seems a little
Just a little
implied.
scared. I was a full-out coward with snakes. So, all right, Jay, were you
That's
more?
amazing. Okay,
were
so-
you braver than us?
Well, so funny enough, my story actually involves a bear. So when I was 16 or 17 years old, some friends and I decided that we would do a canoe trip. And so we went to Algonquin Park for a full week. Our first ever canoe trip, we decided, let's do a whole week. So we went, and on the first night, we were tying up our bags. And one friend said, "What are you guys doing?" And we said, "Well, we're tying up our bags." "Well, why would you do that?" He said, "Well," we said, "because there's bears. So you want to keep your food away from bears." He's like, "There's no bears. That's dumb." We're like, "Oh, okay. You should really do this." "No, I'm not doing that." So he didn't tie up his bag every night. We had a different campsite every night, and he didn't tie up his bag once. And so on like day 5, I wake up to Jay, where'd you put my bag? And I said, I don't know what you're talking about. Quit fooling around. Where did you put my bag?
No.
I said, I didn't touch your bag. Oh, forget it then. And he goes to the next tent. Where did you guys put my bag? We didn't touch your bag. Okay. So then he disappears and we all go back to sleep. And then a little bit later we hear, hey guys, do you want to see a bear? And so we all tiptoe out of our tents and walk up, and sure enough, at the top of a hill about, I don't know, 40 feet away from us was this bear, just going through his pack, eating all of his food.
All
He
the
ate
marshmallows.
he ate like Mr. Noodles and oatmeal, trail mix. He also ate his shampoo, his sunscreen, and to top that off, because he was probably feeling the effects, he ate his Pepto-Bismol.
Oh, wow.
So the bear got it all. So fortunately, it was day 5. There weren't many days left for him to be provided for by us. And that was that. That was our bear. But unlike David, I did not punch him in the face.
That's
and
probably wise.
We were all a little bit frightened. We threw rocks at it and it went away. And
what kind of bear was it?
Oh, it was just a black bear. Like,
okay.
Yeah.
We used to go camping.
There's only black bears in Ontario.
Yeah. We used to go camping every year with my.
You didn't say you were in Ontario.
Sorry,
Fletcher.
Sorry.
I did. I said Algonquin Park.
Oh, did you?
We'll cut this out, I'm sure. Not the whole thing. The whole thing was great. When I was younger, we used to go camping every year. And I was always too scared to go hang the food at night because it was dark by the time we'd go hang the food. And I'd go, no, I'm staying here because I didn't want the bear to get me.
Yeah.
So you're like the same size of a bear, so why are you...
What's with the weight jokes today?
It's not weight, it's height. You're tall.
It's size. Well, and that's that's the tactic with a black bear is you make yourself big and loud and
scary.
Yeah. Well, I'm big and loud, so
you are loud. That's for sure.
Awesome. So, as we always say, if you have an interesting wildlife story that you would like to share with us, you can send that to story@bfmc.org. Or if you have any questions about the show or any topics that you'd like to see us or listen to us cover, then feel free to send us an email. So we're going to jump into today. And so where we left off last week is that the Israelites, they took Jericho, which into the promised land, and they succeeded in taking the land, sort of, because they were told to do something, which was to drive out all of the inhabitants of the land. And they didn't quite do that. They left some. There were still some Canaanite groups living in Israel. And in the beginning of the book of Judges, you actually see which tribes conquered and which failed to conquer certain parts of the country. And so that was happening. But before Joshua died, who was the leader at that time, he renews the covenant that God had given to the Israelites and has everyone commit themselves to God. But then we enter into the time of Judges, and we see that there is a whole lot going on at this time. Idolatry starts to creep in, and there's this phrase that repeats itself throughout the book of Judges, which is, I think, one of the most profound phrases in all of Scripture. We mentioned this in a past episode. It says, "In those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes." And I mean, it's important for us to make note of that in our own lives, that if Jesus is not the king of our lives, we will do what is right in our own eyes. And so it's important for us to learn from that and carry that on in our lives. So the book of Judges carries on, and then we end up with the last of the judges, who was a prophet named Samuel. And the story of his birth is so great. And when he was born, his mother dedicated him to God. And as a child, he assists the high priest, Eli. And we find that Samuel is actually called by God. He hears God's voice. And that's an interesting story where he hears God's voice, and God calls him to become a prophet to the people of Israel. And so that's really good. But then as he's getting older, he appoints his sons to be the next judges, and they are not quite like their father. They're greedy and they pervert justice. And actually there's warning about the behavior that they engage in Deuteronomy 16. It says that the role of the judges, they shouldn't take bribes, and we see that these sons are prone to bribery, and they fail in so many ways. And so Israel gets to the place where they want a king, just like the other nations. And that's also a key point for us to remember, just like the other nations, just like those around us, is never the way that we are meant to be. We're meant to be a holy people, set apart, different than those around us and the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. But they're persistent in their request, and God tells Samuel to do it. That the people are actually abandoning him in this request, not Samuel. So Samuel is troubled by it, and God says, "Don't take it personally. Yeah. It's me that they're rejecting." And he warns the people of what they're doing, but they do not.
Yeah, they're not having it.
No,
they want to be like other nations. They want a king.
God, we know better than you.
Yeah,
right. And how many times do we? I mean, this is convicting as I share it, because I recognize the areas in my life where I often say that, God, I know better.
The peer pressure was real.
Yeah.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
So the time of the judges lasts about 330 years, starting in 1350 BC and ending around 1010 BC. And that's when David was anointed, I think. But today's story takes place after Israel demands a king, and it's around the year 1052. It's while Samuel is judge in Israel. And then the story of David ends in 1025 when he's anointed king. So during this time, kind of historically around the area, the Assyrian Empire is kind of ruling in Mesopotamia. They're a huge nation. We'll hear about them, I'm sure, sometime in this podcast, because they have some relations with Israel. And Egypt is in its third intermediate period. So not a lot's going on over there at the time.
Yeah. So this story, in terms of geography, takes place in the Promised Land, which is Israel. So I'm going to throw a map in the show notes of how Israel was divided, like what tribes settled where. And so you can kind of follow along as we talk about whatever. And Saul conquers a lot of nations all over this land, and to give Israel what God promised them. We're not talking about a specific place in this story, because we're not talking about a specific story. In this episode, we're doing more of a compare and contrast of Saul and David. So that's why we're just kind of saying, okay, it's kind of generally in Israel. Obviously, Bethlehem, the city of Jesse, which is the city of David, and it's just south of Jerusalem. And we also hear about Jabesh Gilead, which is probably east of the Jordan River and south of the Sea of Galilee. And we hear about Gibeah, which is the land of Benjamin. Again, look the map. And the enemies of Israel all around are Moab, Philistine, and the Ammonites.
Yeah, they're all over them. They're basically surrounded. Jay talked about it before, how they failed to drive out the people, and that's now who's at their tails, right, on their borders, kind of attacking them, and that's who they're at war with throughout this whole story that we're going to be talking about. Mm-hmm. So, Israel demands a king. Samuel's kids weren't good enough, so they wanted to be like other nations. So before we even start the thing, I just, like, what's wrong with that? Why is that wrong to want a king like the other nations?
Well, and it comes back to how God had revealed himself to them and governed them and said that they would be different than the nations around them. And so just in the very fact that they want to be like the nations around them is highlighting exactly what's wrong with that, is that God has called them to be different, to be holy, to be set apart, and they want to be just like everybody else. And in saying that to the people, what God is saying to them is, I possess all of the knowledge, wisdom, leadership, and guidance that you require. If you would just trust me, if you would just depend on me, if you would allow me to be your king, then all will be well, and all will be as I've said that it would be. Mm-hmm. But that's where they decide otherwise, and we see how it goes.
Yeah. So God tells Samuel about a man named Saul. He tells him where to go and where to meet him. And Samuel listens and meets Saul and tells him to stay with him tonight because God wants to make him the leader of Israel. Now, I say leader of Israel because it's translated as prince or leader. It doesn't actually say king yet. It talks about being a leader. So that's even, they want a king, God's going to give him a leader. So they're kind of specific on how they say that, because the king is not the same thing as what everybody else thinks as a king. And that's another contrast that comes in. So they're going to make him leader of Israel. Saul says, I'm the least in my tribe. I'm I'm the least in my tribe in Benjamin. And if you want to know why Benjamin is the least of the tribes, you could read the end of Judges. It's a whole story. I'm sure we'll talk about it. But the Benjamites are almost destroyed as a people. So there's not that many of them. And he's like, yeah, right, I'm not going to be the king. Like, look, who am I? But Saul ends up staying the night. And while they're alone, Samuel pours oil on Saul's head and anoints him to be king, or leader of Israel. Samuel then tells him that he'll reign over the people of the Lord, and he will save them from the hand of the surrounding enemies. And then to prove this is true, that he's actually sent by God, Samuel sends it back home and tells him exactly what will happen, including him ending up being filled by the Spirit and prophesying. So he goes home, and then there's this group of prophets that are at his hometown, and he starts prophesying with them, which is really cool, because you don't think of not prophets prophesying, but God sent Saul to prophesy.
Right.
Yeah, and I love that God actually proves it to him, because he didn't necessarily wasn't going to believe it, and then God proves he does all these things to show Saul that he's actually going to be the leader of Israel, actually going to be the king. Right,
and that highlights as well God, even just saying to Saul, "I am who you're being told that I am. I am that I am," is really what he's saying. But and this is evidence of who I am. Yeah. So Samuel then gathers all the tribes of Israel together and tells them that they have abandoned God, that the God that brought them out of Egypt and gave them the land. But here's your king. And it says Saul was taller than everyone from the shoulders up. He was this big, strong guy, and there's nobody like him in all the land. And the people accepted it and shouted, "Long live the king." So Saul is now the king of almost all of Israel. There's a little bit of strife, but for the most part, he is the king. And then Samuel writes down this book of the rights and the duties of the king, and he sets it before the Lord. Looking back at this and reading the story, I go, oh, I'd love to read that book of what a king of Israel is supposed to look like.
Interesting.
Because what it means to be king in Israel is not what it means to be king in every nation, right? The kings of other nations, you're supposed to be like the complete ruler or the absolute authority. Yep. But in Israel, like, your main job is to listen to God, not to be in charge, right? Right. Well, that's also, I think, a very distinct difference. The rulers of the other nations would call on their gods to do the things that they wanted them to do, and the king of Israel was meant to listen to God in order to step into what God wanted them to do, which there's important contrast. The difference there, between telling God what to do and listening to God as to what you're supposed to do. Yeah, that's really cool. I never thought of that. So later the Ammonites are attacking the city, Jabesh-Gilead, which Abby talked about, and it belongs to the tribe of Gad. And the people of Jabesh are asked to make a treaty with the king, and the king agrees as long as he can gouge out the right eye of everyone just to bring disgrace to Israel. So that's not a good deal. So it's surrender and lose an eye, or we're going to kill you all. The elders of the city asked for 7 days just to see if anybody was willing to help them. Otherwise, they would surrender. Right. So the question I have is would you surrender? Is that the cowardly thing to do? Is that the right thing to do? I don't know. It's a hard decision to make because you don't think support is coming. What are you going to do? Yeah, that's a tough one. In my self-righteous stand back and look at the situation, I would say neither, and that the Lord would deliver me. But were I in that situation, I'd be a hard decision to make. It would be
escape
tough.
Into the night.
That's right.
With like two
run
other
away.
People.
Yeah,
basically.
Run away. Just in case you were wondering about the whole right eye thing, it was probably, well, first of all, it's kind of a shame because, you only have one eye and they all got plucked out. But it also had to do with you're not going to be able to fight very well if you had a right eye plucked out. They also held shields kind of in their left hand, and then they could only see out of their left, so they wouldn't be able to fight. So it would very much weaken them as a people if they all lost their eyes. As it would.
What I find interesting is that the king actually lets them have these 7 days. Like, if I were the
Right.
king, I don't think I'd give the people that I'm about to conquer 7 days to see if they can get help to come and fight me. Like,
Yeah.
that doesn't seem like a
Very
good
nice of
move
him.
on
Yeah.
the
If-
king's.
If this is a movie
part.
and it's playing out, you're like, what an
What
idiot.
the heck?
says
Yeah,
yes to
honestly,
that?
who would give? I wouldn't give my enemy help.
Yeah.
Like, that just seems kind of dumb.
All right, so Saul was out in the fields when the message came, and everyone in town was weeping when Saul found out what the message was. And it says the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he was angry because they were all, crying and not doing anything about it. And he killed a bunch of cows and then sent the pieces around Israel with the message saying, if you don't come help fight, this is what I'm going to do to all your herds and all your cows. So he threatens them. And it works, actually. It says dread fell over all the people, and they came out to meet Saul, and they were 300,000 people that actually came out, and 30,000 men of Judah. So the men of Jabesh Gilead heard that Saul's men were coming, but they actually told the king of the Amalekites that tomorrow he could do whatever he wanted to them. They're going to surrender.
Right.
And then the next day rolls around, and Saul's army is there in all its power, ready to fight. And it says that the survivors were so scattered that no two men were left together. So, like, they obliterated them. They won that battle big time.
Yep.
So Saul is now the people's champion. He's brave, he's strong, he's a good warrior, and the people love him. And that's everything a good king should be.
Exactly.
And that's it, right? Nothing more.
Nothing more.
Anything.
So, years later, Saul sends his son Jonathan with 1,000 men to defeat a garrison of Philistines in Gibeah? Yeah. And he succeeds, and Saul encourages all of Israel to stand up and fight the Philistines in Israel. And the Philistines are obviously mad at that. So they gather a huge army. It's like 3,000 chariots with 6,000 men on those chariots. And then it says that there were as many men as the grains in the sand.
That's a lot.
So it's a big army. I can't count the grains of the
Do
sand.
you think that could possibly be hyperbole?
It seems
Maybe.
that way.
I don't think it was literally the grains in the sand, but I don't want to think of how big of an army it would have been for
Right.
real.
That was the author saying, you know what? I just couldn't count that.
Yeah,
out.
I was in the
Just couldn't.
backfield. I lost count after
Yeah.
100,000 or something. Yeah.
That'd be impressive to get to 100.
So the men of Israel were terrified, and they hid in rocks and caves and bushes to try to get away from this crazy Philistine force. And Saul was told to wait for Samuel for 7 days before going into battle. This was an explicit command that Saul was given. Wait 7 days, and so Samuel will come and make sacrifices, and then they can go into battle.
Right.
So Saul waits exactly 7 days and not a minute more,
Nope.
and performs the sacrifices himself. He goes out on his own and says, I'll do it so we can go into battle. He gets impatient. And as soon as he's finishing the sacrifice, guess who shows up?
Oh, hey, Sam.
Well, Samuel arrives, and he is not happy. He rebukes him, and he said, if you had obeyed the command that God gave you, God would have established your kingdom forever. But now it's at an end, and God is looking for someone after his own heart.
Mm-hmm.
So he,
That's harsh,
disowns Saul for disobeying.
Yeah. And also just like, it's important for us to recognize we need to stay in our lane, right?
Mhm.
Saul wanted to do something that wasn't his to do.
Mhm.
It wasn't his job. It was Samuel's to do, and he was given specific orders to wait, and that the sacrifice needed to be made before they went into battle. And so, he needs to stay where he is and continue to wait for Samuel to show up.
Yeah,
and-
that's
and
another
do that.
aspect, kind of the culturally wise. The priest was the one that was supposed to be doing those offerings, not the king.
Yeah.
And there's a big separation in Israel between kingship and priesthood.
Right.
So that's those, and he doesn't care,
Doesn't
essentially.
care.
So what I'm getting at is there's more to being a good king in Israel than just going out and winning the battle.
Right.
There's also being obedient to God.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing, the line that really stuck with me is that had you obeyed this command, God would have established your kingdom forever.
Mm-hmm.
Really? That's so
Right.
cool to hear, because you're like, wait a minute, we've been talking about David's line for this entire season. Is it true?
Right.
So I believe that it's not a lie in the Bible, and I think that Samuel is speaking from God. So I think it says something about what God knows, and he doesn't just know the future, he knows the potential future of what could have been, what
Right.
depending on what we do, right?
And up until this point, the line is actually the line of Abraham.
Yeah.
Right? It's
Right.
from Abraham, and we're following where that's going. And so in this story at this point in time, David is not
Anybody
mentioned.
special? No.
Yeah.
No. So
And-
we don't actually know what's going to happen at this point in the
Yeah.
story.
Yeah.
But looking back, you go, wait a minute.
Yeah.
God worked it all together from the beginning, and you're saying Saul could have been forever.
Right.
But God kind of knew what's going to happen, and he works it all together no matter what our decisions are. So
Right.
Saul messes up, God's still going to work it together for the
He's
good.
still in control.
So Saul continues to win many battles, even though he's kind of disowned. And he does a lot of great deeds. He wins battles against the Philistines. He fights the Moabites. He fights the Ammonites, the Edomites, the kings of Zorah. But something goes wrong again. And the last straw is when God commands him to fight the Amalekites and to utterly destroy them and all their belongings. And this means actually kill everybody and not to spare anything.
Yep.
And if you want to talk about what that means and is that right, it's a separate episode. You can send us an email if you really want us to talk about it.
Right. But this actually dates back to when Israel has gone through the Red Sea and they're experiencing victory. They've come out of Egypt. They're experiencing victory, and the Amalekites meet them in battle immediately. And it's in that battle that God says, I will utterly wipe out and destroy the Amalekites. And so he is giving Saul the opportunity now to step into what he said needs to happen. And as we look at the Amalekites throughout, and they go back as far as Esau, actually, and we see that they're actually a representation of sin and the flesh as it follows us through our journey. And so Saul was told to utterly destroy sin, essentially, and he fails in that because he takes the king alive.
He lets the king live, and he takes some of the livestock alive. And what happens is Samuel calls him out on it. He goes, didn't God command you to destroy everything? And he goes, yeah, of course he did. And he goes, well, what's the king doing over there? And why are these livestock still alive? And he goes, well, I was going to, offer them to God as a sacrifice.
Right.
I don't know how to read that. I think it might be kind of backtracking. I kept them alive because I wanted to, and I wanted to keep the riches. I was going to use it as a sacrifice. Might have been a little bit of an excuse. I don't know.
And if you read that account, it's so he's so oblivious to what's actually going on, and he's saying, "Oh no, we did exactly what we were told." And Samuel's like, "Stop! Why do I hear sheep then? Stop talking, Saul. You're digging a bigger hole for yourself." And then Saul, he still tries to, make it. He over spiritualizes it. He's like, no, we saved the best because then we could sacrifice that to the Lord, and we kept the spoils, because money, we need money, right? Like, how are we going to build a church, right? And he over spiritualizes it. And I think it's important for us to recognize when we are confronted with sin in our lives that we are honest about what's happening, that we're not over spiritualizing it. And after the fact, over spiritualizing it too, to say, no, this is, it looks like this, but what I really meant was for this to happen, and that's because I love Jesus, and that gets us into trouble.
So Samuel comes and he gives him a very famous line, actually. It's like, what's better, a rebellious sacrifice or an obeying heart? And that is such a good question, because you just talked about it with the spirituality and the, I'm going to do it this way to be very spiritual and good. It's not as good as just obeying God. So Saul tried to kind of weasel out of it, or by doing wrong or saying it was for God. Just obey him and you won't have a problem. Don't try to, manipulate the rules to get it to fit exactly how you want it. Just obey it. Yeah. And that's not easy, but
no, totally. And I'm thinking of David's words later on when he says that the sacrifice that pleases God is a broken spirit, a contrite heart. And that's much different than the way that Saul is behaving right now.
So Saul has disobeyed once again, and Samuel says, because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you. that would hurt.
Ouch.
And he gets very, I don't want to say sensitive. He gets very paranoid almost about it afterward. So Samuel is told now to go to the house of a man named Jesse in Bethlehem of Judah. And he's told that he's going to go anoint one of his sons, the new king of Israel. And Saul is very, paranoid. And he doesn't want Saul to know. So what he does is he takes a heifer with him to say he's going to go perform a sacrifice there. Mm-hmm. So he goes to Bethlehem and he calls for Jesse and his sons. Samuel sees one of the sons named Eliab. And he's like, oh, surely this is the guy.
Because he looked like Fletcher.
He's good looking. He's tall.
He's big.
Yeah.
There we go.
And Samuel gives this memory verse that I've always heard is, the Lord does not look at the things that people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart.
Yeah.
And if you go back to when God says, like, what he's looking for in a king is somebody after his own heart is what he's looking for. So he passes 7 sons over of Jesse, and he goes, well, is this it? Is there nobody else? And he goes, well, I guess there's David out in the field. And Samuel's like, well, go get him. And as soon as he passes by Samuel, God tells him that this is the one.
Yeah. The ruddy little shepherd boy.
Yeah, ruddy shepherd boy with nice eyes.
Yeah.
And right then and there, he pours oil on his head and he anoints him. And it says that the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day on.
Yeah.
And it actually also says, and the Spirit of the Lord left Saul. So it's kind of like the spirit of kingship, and the Holy Spirit was on them. Yeah. And it left Saul for David. So that's the end of today's story. We'll talk about David next week as well. But we really wanted to contrast the difference between what it means to be a good king in Israel. So what's the difference between Saul and David?
Right. Well, and we see here that Saul believes in his own strength. That's one of the big things where he and the story says he was so much bigger than everybody else. And even we see, like Samuel, when he's anointing David, he's looking at first the physical appearance and thinks that that's what it takes to be a king. So Saul believed in his own strength, and also because he had victory in battle, although we should understand that God gave him the victory in battle, and so and he should have understood that as well. He did what he thought was right. He's well, we have to perform a sacrifice. It's been 7 days. I'm here. I might as well do it, right? So like he did what he thought was right, which is a continuation of the judges,
right, the judges,
where they did what was right in their own eyes. And so and in that sums up his impatience and his disobedience. And yeah, he was a great warrior. He was a leader that he got the people rallied, but that wasn't exactly what God had called him to do. God had called him to follow him and all that he set before him. And so, yeah, and then we see David is different.
Yeah, so it says in multiple places actually that David was a man after God's own heart. What does that actually mean? Like, we know it's a good thing, obviously. And there's actually a verse in Acts. It's Acts 13:22, and Paul says that David did whatever God wanted him to do, and that's what made him after God's own heart. So he listened to God, and he did it, which was really cool. And then you look at kind of the character of David himself. What stands out to you is that his heart is kind of always on God. He's always trying to please God. He's always trying to do what's right for God. And you mentioned as well, with the kingdom, it's God's kingdom, not his kingdom. Everything he does is for God's kingdom. And that's not saying he doesn't mess up. There's several times he messes up and does terrible, terrible things. But another aspect was he was repentant. When he gets called out for what he does wrong, he regrets it and he feels the shame in him. And there's Psalms written about how bad he felt and the repentance in that. What's another thing? David was a man of faith. He believed in God. He believed that God would, do all things through him. And so you see the story of David and Goliath. You see David uniting the entire nation of Israel through faith. It was he didn't say, I'm doing it. Yeah. He always gave the glory to God.
Because of who he knew God to be, Goliath wasn't even a factor in it. He shows up and he's like, what's going on? God's given us victory. Let's just go. Yeah. And that's, we do well to learn from that.
All right, Abigail.
So that leads us to our final question. How does the story of David fulfill the story of God?
All right. Guess what? I prepared this week.
I'm so proud of you.
I'll take this first half that I think is kind of a cool aspect of it. If you go back to Genesis chapter 49, and it's talking about Jacob blessing the 12 tribes, his 12 sons. And the fourth son is Judah. And he tells that, Jacob tells Judah that his line will rule over all the others, and that the scepter and the ruler's staff will be with him until the one who it belongs to comes. And to him, all the nations would be obedient. And that's to the person who it belongs to, not Judah.
Right.
Anyway, so we see that the tribe of Judah is prophesied to be ruler over Israel like 700-ish years before it actually happened. And in that time, a king was appointed by God, and he wasn't in the line of Judah. But God rejected him because of his own actions, and David is from the tribe of Judah, and he is anointed king.
Right.
And then, the prophecy continues to say that this line will continue until the true ruler comes.
Right.
And that...
you almost wonder in that if God allowed Saul to be appointed as king to have the people see, listen, you don't want this. This is not what you want me to be your king. Please abandon this idea of a human king. And they don't, and they continue to.
Well, that's what I love about Saul is that he is a great human king.
Yeah.
He's so good at everything he does. The only thing is he's king of God's people. He's not king of the other people.
Right.
And that is such a huge contrast because God was not looking for a human king.
Right.
He didn't want it in the first place. The people demanded it, and so he gave it to them. Yeah, like you said, to show them what would happen.
Yeah.
And it didn't work out so hot, right?
Yeah. So David is now the next person to receive the blessing of Abraham, which is, as you mentioned, the last time that we've even heard mention of that is in Genesis chapter 49. And from there, we haven't heard kind of who this blessing is going to go through. We see all of these people popping up in the story, and we see different people highlighted, but we don't know where that blessing is going to fall. And so then we see that it lands on David, and that God then says that he will establish the throne of his kingdom forever through David. And we see throughout that there are many other Old Testament prophecies that are talking about the Messiah coming from the line of David. And as we continue, we'll see just how that unfolds, and we will cap off this season with the genealogy of Jesus as we look at that.
Yeah. So ultimately, this story is a culmination of Israel's history into David is now the one who's going to be continuing that blessing that Abraham received 1,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Good job, guys.
Fun
Thank
you.
times.
All right.
All right. Well, that's it for today.
Thank you so much for listening.
Have a great week.
Bye for now.
See you later.
Bye.